There we go. It's funny. We've
Now,
we've started
go
recording.
ahead.
I haven't been on a webcast with you in forever. Also haven't been on the show in forever. I had people at the last conference. They're like, "Is there some kind of beef between you and John?" Um, I'm like, "Dude, we're just really freaking busy. Is all it boils down to."
Yeah.
So, so
So I'm curious. Can you see my screen and stuff?
I can. Do you want me to? I'll start out with the slide and then I'll pass it off to you then.
All right, hang on. So I have like multiple monitors going on, so I want to make sure that I have the right monitor being displayed.
You do, absolutely. It's the right one.
So that's awesome, and I can see the full GoToWebinar panel on my other screen, which is nice. All
And
right, I'm going to start the recording.
I've already got the recording on my end. It'll stay on
Oh,
this,
okay.
so we're good.
I guess I just clicked record on my end. So
It's
anyway,
double penetration on the recording, I guess.
yes, yes, we're tag teaming it. It's good.
Tag team it.
Um, okay, so everyone can see my screen, so I'll turn it over to you to get started,
Yeah.
John.
So okay, so a little bit of background. I was kind of joking with Paul about this. I was at Sans thing last week, and I had two separate people come up to me, and they're like, "Hey, is there something between you and Paul? Like, are you guys mad at each other?" And I'm like, I don't think so, because you're never on Security Weekly, and Paul's never on the webcasts. And got to thinking about that, and I'm like, well, crap, that's true. And it's not because Paul and I hate each other or anything. It's just we're both really freaking busy with everything that's going on.
Really busy in a good way.
So I thought I'd summon Paul to a webcast by doing a webcast on vulnerability management, which is something that Paul knows a little bit about. So I get this call from Paul, and it's basically, so there's a webcast on vulnerability management. I'm like, yeah, lots of our customers are asking for it. And he's like, you need to stand back. I'm going to show you how this is done. I'm like, okay. It was like a Wild West game. And I'm like, yeah. He goes, now it's pirates, robots, and ninjas. And that's one of the things that we want to throw you for any of these webcasts that you attend at Security Weekly webcasts. We like to throw people for a loop. So the vast majority of this is going to be Paul. I think I have like 6 slides. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to interrupt Paul with your questions and ask them as though they're questions that I asked. So I sound intelligent and worldly. But Paul, let me hand it over to you, sir.
Sure. So this was actually a presentation I gave at B-Sides Boston. John's going to add some of his dimensions and questions that he's been getting as well. Of course, I've worked in vulnerability management for the better part of 6 years, and I decided to tie a lot of my thoughts about vulnerability management into the theme of robots, ninjas, and pirates. So it's interesting how it'll play out throughout this presentation as we'll kind of look at that little analogy in lots of different ways. This is, of course, brought to you by Black Hills Information Security. You can email consulting at blackhillsinfosec.com for all of your penetration testing and active defense needs. I like the little USB thing. Is that new, John? That's nice.
This is the new logo. So
Nice. So here's the agenda. There's going to be some slides with random pictures from the internet. As most of you know that have seen my presentations in the past, I love to do that. And in this presentation, I said, you know what if I just put a random picture from the internet on every slide and see how that goes? So I'll talk about vulnerability management over those slides, and then folks may have questions, and then there'll be more random internet pictures. And then hopefully you'll be laughing at those ridiculous pictures. And unless John added any bullets to the presentation, this will be the only bullets in the presentation. And of course, we'll end with tips on how to be successful. So here's the thing, and now this is going to seem, so you might be taken back by this slide and what I'm about to say by it, but in my experience, and I've been doing vulnerability management long before I was even at Tenable. In fact, I implemented some of the first vulnerability management programs at the university I was working at, and even before that as well. So I've been doing it a long time, discovering vulnerabilities in organizations and trying to report those to people who can fix them and report to management. And over the course of my career, I've talked to a lot of people who are trying to do that in their respective organizations. And what I find is that a lot of people are just plain doing it wrong. Now, this graphic is very applicable to my point here because yes, you're doing it wrong as this gentleman does, but you also have all the tools that you need, or most of the tools that you need, to be successful at vulnerability management, or in this case, to go fishing. This guy has the boat, he's got the fishing rods, he's got the motor, he's got the trailer, but he's just doing it wrong, right?
I like
Um,
I like
Also, he's pretty.
I like how in this picture he has
What's
the
that?
boat tethered to the dock, so
Yes,
so the boat doesn't go.
just in just in case. So this is how I find a lot of people are approaching vulnerability management is pretty much completely backwards. And some people are taken back by that, but I will have advice for you at the end of this presentation. Now, we have arguments like this all the time, and a lot of them center around vulnerability management. And a lot of them are the very similar conversation that we'd have about who wins in a fight, a robot, ninja, or a pirate. And there's some people who think, well, there's no right answer to that question. And some people think, well, there's no right answer to vulnerability management. And I'm not going to take away from the fact that vulnerability management is different in a lot of organizations. How you approach it is slightly different. But do know the answer on this one is robot, ninja, pirate, Jesus is the answer. Did you catch that, John? It's robot, ninja,
Nice.
pirate, Jesus. Yes. Um, so why do we need vulnerability management? I don't think anyone will dispute that there are numerous threats out there on the internet and maybe internally as well. And this is often how you feel when you are responsible for security of a network, right? There are lots of threats out there. Now, these threats come in many different shapes, forms, sizes, attackers of all different kinds, which we'll talk about. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of threats, and vulnerability management, albeit one of the more difficult things that you have to implement, is the answer to all of the threats that are lurking outside of your network or threatening your kitty cats, as it were. So one of the things is to not be blind, right? We saw the cat walking in front of all the dogs and pretty oblivious to the threats that are out there. And not so much to the threats, but a lot of people are blind to a lot of their exposures. And I find this is one of the things that's common in vulnerability management. Everyone seems to do it in a certain capacity. And they stick their heads in the sand and they say, well, we don't want to know about those problems because, well, we can't see them, so they're not really problems. And some people have it worse than others. Some people are like, well, there's whole subnets out there that I know is there, but I don't want to know about those vulnerabilities. Or if I log into my systems with credentials and I discover all these other vulnerabilities, I don't want to do that. I don't need to know about those vulnerabilities. I only want to fix what I can find on a network scan. And the point here is to not be blind. And we'll talk about some of the challenges that once you're kind of awakened to a lot of the exposures in your network, what you can do about them, because inevitably as technology has moved forward, we have a lot more exposures in our network. We also have a lot more tools to find those exposures. So we have this problem that comes down to, well, how do we manage all those vulnerabilities, hence the problem of vulnerability management. So there are robots, ninjas, and pirates in your security department. And I want to look at the robot, ninja, and pirate example as it relates to the different personas that exist within your organization. The first is the robot, and we all know this person who's scanned the network. Many of us did this probably several years ago, right? They are going to scan the network, and I'm going to unleash the fury of a vulnerability scanner or some such scanner on the network without a care in the world. I'm not going to really tell anyone. If I do, I'm not going to take into consideration things I should not scan. I'm a robot. I'm going to go about it methodically. I'm going to scan everything. I'm going to look for everything on all of the things that I find.
And I think the Terminator.
Now the robot, when they get to reporting.
Oh, Paul.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think the Terminator themanology on the last one is absolutely apt, because we had somebody that we both know who contacted us, who was working for another pen testing firm, and his boss wanted him to scan an entire hospital network, including like dialysis machines and all of the really sensitive stuff you really shouldn't scan. and he was fighting back and forth with his boss. Finally, I got involved in the call, and the boss basically held up the contract and he said, "It doesn't matter. We got an indemnification clause. They can't hold us liable for anything bad that happens. Don't be a robot. It may not sound like that big of a
Mhm.
deal, but yeah, people can die."
Well, and the other characteristic of the robot is when it comes to the report. And we've all, we've done webcasts about this topic before, how an automated scan will run, I click file print, I print out the report, and I pile a gigantic stack of paper on someone's desk, and I call that reporting. And
Yep.
obviously, that's given vulnerability management a bad name. And in fact, that's not management at all. That's the robot just going and finding a whole bunch of stuff and then reporting on it.
Well, and we've had people that have shot us emails in the past. I mean, how many times have you gotten emails from people saying, "Look, I want a script that converts Nessus output into a Word document. Do you know of any tool that can
Right.
do that for me?" And we're like,
Yeah.
"No."
Don't do that. Now, the robot has not taken into consideration any of the environmental states on the network, and this is pretty much what your network will look like after the scan. As if you just, point and shoot a vulnerability scanner at the network, likely some bad things will happen, and that tends to be what your network looks like after the scan. Of course, probably one of the most detrimental things to the robot scanning is the systems administrators, network administrators, developers, help desk, and operations. They haven't been given a heads up. You've done this robot scan thinking you're doing good. However, they all pretty much have this opinion of you now because you haven't given them the heads up, and pretty much you're the asshole now. And they don't like you. And now you've set the precedent in your environment that vulnerability scanning and then even extended to vulnerability management is bad. It's bad. When this activity happens, bad things happen. Don't do that anymore because bad things happen. And setting that precedent within your organization is really, really bad. And probably the most detrimental thing to the robot scanning is how it changes the perception of vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management in your environment. When the robots report to management, it's kind of interesting. It's one of the most popular questions we get. How do I report to management? And the robot reports to management those raw results with no context for the business, with no concept of communication, leadership, recognizing the issues and the problems and the interactions between the different teams and the processes that need to be taking place. Robots really just say, well, there's 725 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in your network. What does that mean to who you're reporting to? What is often left out?
No.
Yes, if you read that, I took the lines from Star Wars because I'm a nerd and
But I
I
was going to say,
became.
did you actually modify it to be security relevant?
I did. I
That's
did. It's
that's
very.
awesome and terrifying all at the same time.
Yes. I guess I needed to validate my nerd card. Okay, so obviously the moral of the story is we don't want to be a robot. Now that's not to say, don't take away from that, well, I shouldn't automate, because absolutely you need to automate certain processes within your vulnerability management program, without question. But all of the things that I've outlined for the robot being a negative things are things you want to stay away from in your vulnerability management program. Now, the ninjas are a different group within your security team or your network administration team. And the ninjas are trying to accomplish the same thing. They're trying to find all of the problems within the organization. And they'll do things like write an nmap script that, hey, goes ahead and finds all of the telnet in your environment, automatically brute forces the password, and then logs in as root and disables telnet. Now, this strategy, and we can talk about that at the end of where I think vulnerability management needs to go from a technology standpoint, is not necessarily a bad strategy. The problem with the ninja is that they're not telling anyone, and they're just doing this on their own and affecting change in your environment without telling anyone. And also, this is what their report looks like. And they're never reporting on these. They're the ninja. They're scripting it silently and quietly. They're not working with anyone. They're finding these conditions, possibly even fixing them, and just not telling anyone about their results.
And there's a lot of reasons why we have ninjas do this. Like a lot of them are, they just don't want to deal with people. But I think that we're also running into a lot of security people that are sick and tired of trying to go through the political back channels. of trying to
Hmm.
get things fixed, that they just do it on their own. And I think that also has to drive from the fact that, a lot of systems administrators, because robots burning networks down, don't want to talk to the security team. So somehow that communication is broken down, and it's good to find out why.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the ninjas aren't going to cause problems, except it's going to take a lot more.
Hmm. Okay. So I think we lost Paul. Can you guys hear me? Okay. What's actually hilarious about this is I think that you guys could stop typing yes. I know that we've click faster. I have lots of experience at that. So just give me a moment. So this is the part of the presentation where I need to shoot an email to Paul or call him and be like, "You're gone, dude." Which is weird because I'm usually the one that disappears because of gremlins in the Matrix as well. So I guess I could try to channel my best Paul Asadorian, and I'll pull up the slides here in just a couple of seconds. And I think it's absolutely hilarious how, if you look at the this slide, the whole goal of this slide is chaos happens, right? Um, Chaos occurs in various places. So here we have chaos occurring everywhere, and problems can be mysterious, just like your co-presenter being dropped off of the call. Lost audio, and I'll shoot that to him now. And then I think I'm going to take over being a presenter. Just give me a second here, and actually, this is why it's nice to have a backup plan from time to time. Oh my God, he has a lot of slides that I'm just going to have to try to figure out how I'm going to present to. So this is quickly going to become a presentation of slide roulette. I don't know if you guys have ever seen slide roulette, but that's where we're heading. All right, can you guys see my screen now? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to guess what Paul would say for these slides. Now, mind you, Paul left me with absolutely nothing on this presentation. So it's basically a bunch of screenshots, and then he has stories and narratives behind those various screenshots as well. And hopefully he'll jump back in because he's still an organizer. I'm going to see if he's jumped back in as far as being an attendee. Maybe he jumped off and then came back. It's not the first time this has happened. Yeah, Paul just went all ninja on us. No backup plan. I am the backup plan. So HIJKLMNO. God dang it, there's a lot of people on this presentation. And there he is. So now I'm going to make him a presenter. And let's see if we got Paul back. Paul, can you hear us? We've got a new Paul. Mr. Asadorian, channeling Mr. Asadorian. We can see your mouse. If you can hear us, Paul, shake your mouse left to right. If you can't hear us, just make your mouse go up and down. Best part about this is Paul basically said he was going to get a new computer. He's got it. It's going to be there here in just a little bit. So I'm making Paul an organizer. Let's see if we can get his microphone working. Actually, he has no microphone. There we go. Now we might have it. Paul, can you hear us? We still have nothing, sir. Hmm. So, Paul, I'm going to jump ahead to my slides. And whenever you get your audio back, just chat with us. Basically, be like, yo, I can talk again. And we'll just take it from there. So I'm going to make myself presenter again. There we go. And we'll see when he shows up. Show my screen. All right. So, we're talking about chaos, right? So if you look at chaos, we got systems administrators, whenever anything happens, whenever you're doing a vulnerability assessment, one of the things that you'll notice is that you're blamed for it on a very regular basis. And we got to figure out why exactly we get blamed for absolutely everything that occurs during the time of a scan. One of the things that keeps me awake constantly is that one of the people at BHIS will bring down a large scale network. And that's just, as we say in the biz, that's really, really, really bad, because you're always going to get blamed. Now, to that end, we get blamed for literally everything that occurs. I mean, we can be scanning a subnet, let's say a 10.10.10.x subnet, and then something happens over in a 192.168.40 subnet. And they're like, yeah, clearly it was the security testing company that is responsible for this, because everyone gets this get out of jail free card as soon as it occurs. And then Paul threw in this random slide that's basically, as near as I can tell, one of the most disturbing and beautiful things I've ever seen in the history of PowerPoint presentations. And Will just.
John, are you there?
Oh, I can hear Paul. He's back,
Wow.
everybody. Cool.
Yay.
So
Sorry, it was right at the time I was talking about like chaos happening on the network. So
it was great timing.
pretty funny, actually.
So I've got to ask you, what the hell is the deal with this slide right here?
Oh, so well, ninjas, when they're confronted by systems administrators or network administrators about causing problems on the network, they're like, no, your argument is invalid. They're like, nope, nothing wrong here, right? They're trying to avoid the political issues that are associated with just going in and doing things without telling anyone, and therefore, your argument is invalid.
So, and you thought the best way to capture that essence was Darth Vader with a unicorn.
Yes, absolutely. Makes perfect sense.
From slide roulette perspective, that pretty much shut me down. So I'm going to be
I love it.
I'm going to be your slide monkey now. So just tell me when you want to progress there. So here we go.
So pirates in your network, they're like, I got to find the booty. I'm going to scan your network hard. So go to the next slide. And they do just that, and that's kind of what it looks like during the scan. Now, pirates may be a little more communicative than a robot or a ninja, and there's usually a lot of chaos during the scan. And again, their goal is really just to find the booty, and they're going to use any means necessary in order to do that. So next slide. The advantage when the pirate does vulnerability scanning is that you do get the big, long-ass report. However, it comes with RUM. So, everything is just better with RUM. So, next slide. Now, this is really where I identified with the pirate, right? And I have to admit that sometimes I've been the pirate in this situation. But the pirate in the meeting, they report the vulnerabilities, unlike the ninja, and they report them differently than the robot. They basically stand in the meeting and they scream and yell and bang on the table and say, patch your shit. And then they, scream like a pirate. And that's also a way, not a way to do vulnerability management, as it gives that negative connotation to the vulnerability management program. So you have to have some social skills. The sysadmins are not happy with the pirate, right? They've just scanned the network. The pirates have yelled at them to patch everything inside of all of the meetings, and again, it gives that negative connotation to vulnerability management.
And the other thing that's nice about being a pirate is you can show up and you can look badass at cons, and you can come across as like this uber elite hacksaw. But the reality is, you probably aren't achieving all that much. So there's definitely some disadvantage.
Very true. Very true. So now on to the attackers. So as I said, those are some of the internal problems that you might have experienced with vulnerability management. Sometimes, like I said, we find ourselves taking on some of those roles. Sometimes you can't just help be a pirate in a meeting where people don't want to patch the vulnerabilities that you've discovered. However, the threats out there are real, and you need to have vulnerability management to deal with these threats. And threats come in the categories of robots, ninjas, and pirates. And this is interesting perception of scanning, right? And this is very much the robot aspect of scanning. A lot of you have probably looked at your logs, and you've probably seen, that everyone has a script, all the, Turkish hacking groups, Estonian hacking groups that are in a race to deface as many web pages as possible, have a script and looking for every cold fusion, everything listening on port 80. Let's see if it's a cold fusion server, and let's see if it has this vulnerability. And so it kind of goes along with the analogy of even a broken clock is right twice a day. So there are people out there that are just scanning everything. Now, on the flip side of that, the perception of scanning is not portrayed very nicely in the movies or even in your own environments, is that scanning is kind of arduous work. It doesn't require much thought or intelligence behind it. When in this case, when you want a good vulnerability management program, there absolutely has to be a lot of planning, a lot of intelligence built into your scanning and your strategy for scanning, which needs to be much more than I'm just going to hit every port 80 and look for cold fusion vulnerabilities.
But let's also be honest, that whole methodology of scanning for port 80 on millions of systems and then hitting cold fusion vulnerabilities, even though that doesn't really work from a vulnerability management perspective, I think everybody needs to understand that it's hella effective for the attackers. They break
Absolutely.
a tremendous amount of networks using just that type of technique.
So of course, attackers like robots, they like to automate, and these are some of the threats that you deal with in your environment every day, right? There's, spam attacks, there's Bitcoin mining, and hundreds of millions of botnets. And to kind of speak to John's point, it's successful for attackers, and you have to fend off this level of attackers, and your vulnerability management program can help you, because if you can patch your cold fusion systems, as to use a bad example, I guess, you won't be vulnerable to this level of attack. Next slide. So, the next level is kind of the, well, I hate to say it, APT or cyber something. And a lot of these attacks, of course, are going to be very entrenched in your network to represent kind of the ninja aspect of the attackers that are out there. And these threats, of course, are very real. I think they come in different shapes, form, and sizes. There are attackers that do want to be on the inside of your network for different reasons. A lot of these groups are broken down into multiple levels. So you may have the group that is responsible for information gathering, and you may have the group that actually implants a backdoor in several of your systems and goes beyond just the automated scanning in order to accomplish that. And they may be selling this access to yet another group. So there are those threats to deal with, and again, it may not be one particular group looking for your intellectual property. It may be something completely different. It could be a multi-stage attack or going across multiple hacking groups, but you do have to be prepared that essentially what these attacks mean is the inside of your network has to be hardened too. So, next slide. And of course, there are the ones that scare me the most. There are the super ninjas, right? And these are the people, the attackers that we don't see. And those are the ones that scare me the most. The ones that maybe they are the groups that have targeted your organization, they want your intellectual property, and they're going to go to great lengths not to be detected. And making sure that you have a sound vulnerability management program is just one way in which to decrease your chances that the ninjas are going to lurk inside of your network. Next slide. I kind of struggled a bit to find the cyber pirate attackers. When you think of pirates, you think of people who are looking to steal copyrighted material. Certainly, that can be the case. There are also pirates that will steal your bandwidth. It's kind of a cross. In this respect, a pirate is a cross between a robot and a ninja. They're going to automatically scan for things, but they're going to maybe dig a little deeper and use it for a specific purpose once they find those things. Typically, they're not after your intellectual property, but they may be after some copyrighted material or other things in which they want to replicate for their own purposes. So you kind of have this level of attacker that's kind of a blend of the robot and the ninja. Next slide. So what we learned up to this point is that vulnerability management is hard, right? Because we've all, I think, many of us have tried to be the robot, the ninja, and the pirate in respect of the vulnerability management program, and we've probably been met with mixed success, mostly not being successful with those specific tactics. We also know that the attackers are not going to let up. They come in many different shapes, form, and sizes. So now that we understand some of the dynamics, let's talk about how we deal with some of these things. And the way that some people deal with these are, well, shortcuts, right? I find a lot of people taking shortcuts in vulnerability management. We know we need to do it. We know we can't do it like the robot ninja or the pirate, so we're just going to do this. So we're going to take a shortcut. And I hate the word just. Anytime someone's describing their vulnerability management program and they use the word just, it's a huge red flag. We're just going to scan this part of the network. We're just going to scan at our corporate headquarters. We're just going to scan Linux and Windows systems. Anytime you put that word just, you're leaving room for attackers to find the vulnerabilities that you're not looking for.
And we also
Which is
use
fine.
that. We also use that kind of as a, I guess, an acid test for a number of our customers. Whenever we're talking about a pen test, or we're talking about an assessment or an internal command and control pivot, if they do start using words like that, then we have no problems asking directly. It's like, what is your main motivator for having this assessment? What is your main motivator for having this pen test? And inevitably, it always is going to be, we really want it. We want it done right. We want you to do it. Attackers are doing one. Really, really good job. But then you say, well, you use the word just. Now, why are you doing the limitations of the scope? And they're like, well, we want to keep it as cheap as we possibly can. And as soon as you hear that, then you know exactly what the main motivator is. It's not actually to find vulnerabilities. You know that that's kind of a flag at that point. And this is something, as an external consultant, this is something you can identify on the inside of your environment for the ones you work for. You now know that they're looking for a vulnerability assessment to be as cheap as possible. They're compliance checklists at that point.
Yeah, and some other examples of this are we just scan once per quarter, so you adjust the frequency of how you scan. We just use the default scan policy, so you adjust how you scan. And like I said before, we just scan parts of the network. And really, that's just a way to say, look at all the things that I can't see, because
Well,
you're limiting how you can scan the network.
in that second bullet point, I want to drive that one home. Um, so, so Paul's relationship with BHIS is kind of an interesting one, because a lot of times he troubleshoots issues that we think we have with Nessus, or problems that we're running into with scanning. And one of the things that he kicked our butts on, I think like 5 years ago, is a lot of our scan policies were just the raw default policies. And literally, he said, you're going to be missing a tremendous amount if you're pulling it down to that particular level. So, working with Paul, setting up and tuning the results. So we actually get much higher fidelity than we would normally. Now, there may be a higher false positive rate. There may be a lot more informationals and lows, but that's actually where we're being successful in breaking into organizations. So that second one is incredibly important. Almost every single good vulnerability scanning program that I see does some level of customization to specifically match their organization.
Yeah, and it's interesting where those three bullet points end up is, you're looking at how often you scan, how you scan, what things you're looking for, and then what targets you're going after inside of your network. And those are three fundamental things you need to define for your vulnerability management program. The other thing is the severity of the things that you're finding, and people have some interesting ways of defining severity, because maybe they don't care about finding all of the vulnerabilities. I just want to see the important ones, to kind of speak to your point, John. I can't fix everything, so don't bother showing me everything. And they tune their scans, and they only work off of a particular set of arbitrary rules, such as CVSS, and say, I'm only going to pay attention to and fix CVSS scores that have a 7.0 or greater. And you're leaving out so many different vulnerabilities. And one of the things that really amazes me is how penetration testers and attackers alike can find those paths into your network. Those paths are typically how you end up with a breach. And defining those paths, and when you look at those paths don't just include vulnerabilities that are greater than the 7.0. They don't just include vulnerabilities you can find with a regular scan. They may include misconfiguration. They may include firewall misconfigurations. They could include patches. They could include running services. There's this whole number of factors that make up vulnerability management. And by limiting the scope to something like severity, you're missing out on a whole bunch of stuff that is relevant when you have a breach.
And this is also something that is getting worse over time. much like
Absolutely.
the wonderful slide articulates. If we go back to 2000, 2001, 2003, 2004, 2005 timeframe, we started ignoring lows, informationals, mediums back then. And we continue to ignore those lows, informationals, mediums over time. And what we're noticing is in many organizations, we've kind of hit an inflection point where they've ignored everything with the CVSS score under 7 or under 4.5 or whatever the number is that they choose arbitrarily, and it's getting to the point where it's becoming so mountainous. There's so many informationals and lows and mediums that we're now getting in very consistently just through those informationals, lows, and those mediums, because you have to piece things together. It's puzzle piece, put it together to find the picture to get in. But it is getting worse over time. And this is one of the things I was wondering. Now, Paul, you guys, for people that choose to opt in, do you guys still collect metrics on vulnerability scanning, or is that dead?
No, yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah, you don't
We've
do that.
talked about it. Yeah, we talked about it. It's not being done.
Yeah.
There might have been a program a while back, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure
I
what the
haven't seen it
status of it.
pop up in forever, so I don't think it's anything like that anymore at all. But this would be an interesting trend analysis, and this is something we're starting to collect at BHIS internally, and we're looking at it. And we've noticed over the past few years, at least I've noticed it looking at the vulnerabilities, that these numbers of, like I said, informationals, lows, mediums that have been ignored are really starting to spike because they're just not being looked at ever.
So there's a lot of reasons why that it will end badly if you severely limit the scope of your vulnerability management program. And bad decisions are not just unique to vulnerability management either. Next slide. So what you don't know will probably be the thing that hurts you, that you can't react or make adjustments to exposures in your network that you never knew existed in the first place. Sure, there might be things that you can't patch. Sure, there might be configuration that you can't change, but there's lots of different ways to monitor those exposures, to maybe put some other kind of compensating control around those exposures that you can only do if you know about that vulnerability. And how many times have we seen a breach and the company has come out and said, well, hey, we knew about that vulnerability and, we tried to fix it, but we couldn't. It's almost always, oh yeah, we had this exposure and we didn't know about it. And that's what came back and actually contributed to us having a breach. So the more you know, the better. And again, stringing low severity vulnerabilities together to achieve a goal is something that's been talked about quite a bit. Chris Gates actually in 2012 did a from low to pwned and talked about how he was able to string lower severity vulnerabilities together to achieve a goal. And this has been done since the beginning of time. It's one of the foundations for, in fact, how you are able to break into or attack a network. It's not always that super glaring high severity vulnerability. There's a certain path to it. And you may say, well, I'm not going to patch the lower severity ones on this system because it's not critical. But when you start mapping the paths in and out of your network, that system, while it might not contain sensitive information, is a stepping stone to get to that sensitive information. I mean, John could probably tell you stories for a whole other hour about how we've done that on penetration tests, right?
Cool. So, Paul, we had a whole bunch of things blow up in the questions, and the consistent theme was, I am never going to get to the lows, informationals, and mediums. Or one of my favorite quotes, we will address the lows, informationals, and mediums in phase two. There will never be a phase two. And it's a consistent theme. I don't have the people, I don't have the budget, I don't have the time to actually do that. And it's a consistent theme. Please stick with us. I'm going to talk about how we address and look at the lows and informationals and mediums to actually find the ones that are exploitable here in just a little bit. So please stick with us. But the thing you don't want to do is to basically shut down and say, we're never touching those things because it's just not possible. Because if you're doing that, then you're kind of missing the point of your vulnerability management program. You're missing the point of how your vulnerability assessment tool should be used. And we'll get to that in a moment. Just sit tight.
So things change in your network. External conditions change. So not patching vulnerabilities because there's no public exploit today doesn't mean there could be one in the future. So if you're making decisions about what to patch and what not to patch in your environment, that that those vulnerabilities can be influenced by external conditions, if you're not taking that into account, then you're doing a disservice to your systems and leaving yourself exposed to potential threats that there's a likelihood that they could exist. A lot of people will say, well, I'm only going to patch vulnerabilities that have an exploit for them. Or, in that, looking at it in that light, you don't know if someone has an exploit. In fact, there could be a vulnerability that's released that's flagged as not exploitable that someone may have an exploit for. We talked about the different levels of attackers, so you can't rely on external conditions that change in order to make decisions about how to secure your own systems. It's not a valid criteria for what you should and should not fix. Now, internal conditions change probably more frequently than external conditions, and this is where I've seen a huge shift in the past 5, even 10 years, is that now, while I don't have XYZ software and I'm only really going to look for or patch or address the software I have today, the problem is that changes moment by moment. We're in a world now where virtualization and cloud technologies allow us to create new systems and software with the click of a button. You may not have an Apache PHP installation doing, in your environment today, but with the click of a button, I can deploy a new virtual appliance that has all the software pre-configured. It, quite frankly, likely has not been hardened and is vulnerable in a lot of different ways, and now I have that software in my environment. So you have to look for everything and look for all of the new things on your network and incorporate that into your vulnerability management program. And here's just an example of that. You can skip that slide. So vulnerability management is not just about finding vulnerabilities and going out and fixing them, right? There are a lot of technologies that exist in vulnerability management tools today that provide a historical reference. And this can be very valuable not only to understanding your exposures, but also doing forensics as well. Because vulnerability management software and systems have evolved so much, we can tell you what USB devices were plugged into your systems. Now, that may not be a vulnerability today, but think of it on an oil rig, where malware was introduced to a completely isolated network on an oil rig. The team that was called in to analyze those vulnerabilities scanned every system with a vulnerability scanner that reported the USB device history of everything that was plugged into those systems. They were able to identify the USB key that contained the malware and then cross-reference that with all the other systems that malware or USB key was plugged into. So don't think of vulnerability management as going out and actively finding all your vulnerabilities today. Think of it as a database that can contain this information that you can use to react to, either to close down your exposures or do some kind of incident response as well.
Oh, there's the oil rig.
There's the oil. That's actually the oil rig that had the mouth. No, it's not. I'm just kidding. So we talked about this, about having goals and results that matter. There's two different kind of thoughts here. Just send them the raw results and let them try and fix everything on their own. Well, that's overwhelming for them, so just patch CVSS that's 8.0 or greater. And those are two tactics that we'll talk about how to deal with today's technology. And I mean, results matter, and no one reads the raw results. I mean, let's just be frank. When you deliver those raw results, no one is going to read them. They're going to be overwhelmed, and report writing is not fun. So let's see.
This is your slide.
Is this your slide?
This one's mine.
Is this your slide?
Yep.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't know what to say about this slide because I don't remember writing it.
I don't remember writing this slide. All right, so let's talk about how we look at things. Whenever we're testing organizations, one of the things we get commonly from those organizations is we have a vulnerability management program. We have someone in charge of that vulnerability management program, but you can't talk to them because they jumped off the top of the building last week. And it's a hard position to be in. It's kind of one of those crappy positions that a lot of people throw to the lowest common denominator in their organization because it is incredibly tedious, because it is incredibly difficult. But you run the risk of kind of pawning it off to ASOC, the intern, to do your vulnerability management for you, that you're going to miss significant things. So let's talk about how you can actually look at those lows, mediums, informationals in a way that actually is effective. So one of the problems that we see many organizations encounter today is they try to do their vulnerability management based on IP address. So let's say they have 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 IP addresses. They run the vulnerability assessments and then they chunk them up by IP address responsibility. And they say, Bill, you're responsible for the 14 vulnerabilities on this IP address and the 12 vulnerabilities on that IP address and the 10 vulnerabilities on that IP address. And it becomes this cascade of crap. It becomes almost impossible to get through every single one of those vulnerabilities. And trying to manage it that way is just not going to be effective. So we say this is dumb. So if you're trying to do the vulnerabilities by host, don't do this. It doesn't work. It never will work. It never has worked. The larger your organization gets, the more ineffective this actually gets as well. Breaking it up by subnet, giving it to the systems administrators on the subnet, trying to track it in your plan of actions and milestones as vulnerabilities per IP address is just not going to work. And what we see as a result of people trying to do it this way is they boil it down to just the criticals. They boil it down to just the highs, and those are the only vulnerabilities they're going to take care of because those are the only vulnerabilities they have time to take care of because that's how they're looking at their results. And this makes sense logically. As a human being, you're looking in terms of what are the vulnerabilities on my systems, and you're constantly going to have to rationalize that as the number of systems and the total number of vulnerabilities because that's how we think about things. And it turns out that this is actually the most ineffective way of trying to do a vulnerability assessment and manage the vulnerabilities. Instead, we recommend this. So this is from one section of a smaller, it's a small part of a pen test that we did a little while ago. And instead of sorting it by IP addresses, we sort it by the actual plugin ID or by the vulnerability itself. So instead of saying I have a system and it has an SSL certificate that cannot be trusted, I now see that I have 140 systems that have an SSL certificate that just cannot be trusted. So now I can make a determination at a very high level of do I care about this or not? Do I care about self-signed certificates? Do I care about SSL version 2? If you do care, as a high-level vulnerability manager, or the CISO, or the tech manager, then you can basically make an organizational push to try to get rid of these vulnerabilities globally. Because it's far easier to get rid of them using Puppet, Chef, or using domain controller, group policy preferences, not preferences, Jesus, that would actually lead to vulnerabilities, group policies, than it is to try to address them in a single system, one off at a time. So you're not looking at the vulnerabilities from the terms of the number of IP addresses versus the vulnerabilities on those IP addresses. You're breaking it down to the total number of vulnerabilities across the entire organization. Another way to put this that makes sense, if your organization has 5,000 systems in it, odds are you're not going to have 5,000 unique vulnerability or plugin IDs that'll actually be used. Very rarely do we see this get too far into the hundreds. Most tests that we have will see maybe 200 to 300 separate vulnerability or plugin IDs cross-referenced across hundreds or thousands of systems. And it's much easier to address and look at a few hundred vulnerabilities than it is to look at a few thousand systems and the vulnerabilities that they exist on. And I'll show you kind of how we trace through this here in just a couple seconds. Let's start with this. So here's a scan, a fairly large scan for one segment. Whenever we scan, we'll usually break our scanning up across multiple different segments to make sure that we get proper visibility and we don't pull too many results down. Break it up by network segment. But this was a big one. So we had 559 with device type. We have 551 common platform enumeration, SSL certificates or suites. But the big one I wanted to show you is web server directory enumeration. And then you also have HTTP methods allowed per directory. This is an example of a vulnerability that I see, and I talk about this all the time in every single class, in every single presentation. I see web server directory enumeration, and I giggle like a little girl. I love it. And even if I have 500 of those vulnerabilities, and this is actually an informational from the scanning tool, it says, hey, I can do some enumeration on the directories on these systems. 500, I can burn through those very, very quickly. It would probably only take me about 15 minutes to go through 500. Why? Well, let me show you. So this is kind of what it looks like. Whenever you're looking at the results of a tool like Nessus, and you actually click on that plugin ID or you click on that vulnerability, it brings up all of the header information that it actually received or the data associated with it for each individual system. All right. Now, as I'm going through and I'm parsing through that vulnerability data, I'm going to see themes, right? So even though we had back here 507 web server directory enumerations, 300 of those were this: icons and images. I don't care about icons and images. I just don't. If I'm trying to break into your organization, I have never broken into an organization by hacking through the icons or the images directory. Now, I'm sure that there's really fantastic people out there that have. I haven't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just scroll through those because I know it's the exact same thing again and again and again and again. But then I come across a batch that say the following directories were discovered, and it says admin, admin, forms, and images. I get excited whenever I see things like, admin, forms, docs. Those are the directories that I really get excited about. So on the bottom one, the following directories were discovered, admin and then / docs. That's a gold mine for me. So I can quickly, let's say within 15 minutes, go through over 500 vulnerabilities very, very quickly, and I can key in on this one. Now, there was more, but I'm just showing this on this slide. We had one server that had an admin directory, a docs directory. It also had a host manager directory and a manager directory. Whenever I went to the docs directory, I came across a text file, and within that text file, it had a username. It was XML file, but it was text. It was saved on the server in .txt format. And in that XML data, you can see that there is a username, and then there was a password value, which I've redacted. And that password was what it was using to access the database on the back end. That same user ID and that exact same password was also used on the admin pages. So whenever I went to the admin pages, it asked for authentication. You put in the user ID, you put in the password. Congratulations, you're now in. So the point is, if you look at your vulnerabilities as, looking and sorting based on plugin ID and or vulnerability name instead of by IP address, wow, I mean, it makes it so much faster to blow through vulnerabilities at a much higher rate of speed and look at those lows, look at those informations, look at those warnings, and make a determination as to whether or not you care about them and you're going to address them. You're going to be swimming in SSL vulnerabilities. Unless there's an active exploit, or we're talking about something like Heartbleed, we tend to kind of put those on a plan of actions and milestones, something that needs to be addressed a much later date, right? But the lows of like directory enumeration for documents with user IDs and passwords, now those are things that are going to have to be addressed. And that gets to the point of what a good vulnerability assessment tool is. A good vulnerability assessment tool is going to find the low-hanging fruit for you. It is. It's going to find those big, high CVEs where exploits are remotely available. But it's also going to serve as an effective lens, as a viewing point into a network. And that's really what vulnerability management needs to get to. It's the point where you're using these tools as tools to enumerate and learn as much as you can about your organization, rather than just scanning and expecting it to come back and tell you exactly what's going on. Ron Gula years ago said that, a pen test should not be someone just running a vulnerability assessment scanner and then running Metasploit off of it. It just shouldn't be. That doesn't make any sense. And he's absolutely correct. But if you can use these things to get down to the lows and informationals, then you're actually getting to the point where you're doing a fairly solid penetration test. And I'll hand it back over to Paul for this slide.
Yeah, and one of the things to talk about prioritizing by severity is, some people will come to vulnerability management software creators and say, hey, we patch everything that is an 8.0 CVSS score or greater. We don't really want to patch this vulnerability, so can you make this a 7 for us? And what you need to understand is that CVSS is subjective. It's the severity rating of the vulnerability, not the vulnerability as it exists in your environment. So next slide. So here are some of your goals, and these are some of the tips that we have for you to make your vulnerability management program all that much more better. So a lot of us, we tend to, we're perfectionists in security. We want to wait for the perfect solution, but the goal really is prevention, is to prevent the bad things with the resources that you have. The perfect solution likely doesn't exist for you, so you need to implement some countermeasure that's going to prevent bad things from happening as best you can within your environment. I think that John made a great point when he said that Puppet, Chef, I'll add CF Engine to the list, that good configuration management is one of the foundations that you need to have across all of your systems so that when you do run a vulnerability scan, you don't find all of these vulnerabilities. And you can greatly cut down and prevent a lot from these vulnerabilities even being in your vulnerability management program to begin with. Next slide. So no detection. So then you say, well, okay, we're not going to be able to prevent everything, but we need to know where we are vulnerable and monitor. So this goes back to if you're detecting everything in all of those conditions, now we can go see where we're most vulnerable and monitor that to make sure that no bad things are happening. To speak to John's example, John, was that a Tomcat system?
It actually wasn't, but the actual configuration file was off of a Tomcat system, which was very weird.
Okay. Yeah. So, once you know that you have those issues in your environment and they're low vulnerabilities, well, now I can go to my intrusion detection, my intrusion prevention, my SIM, and I can say, hey, tell me about all of these different scenarios and monitor those systems. Maybe I can't patch all of those things today. I'm behind the curve, but at least I can monitor and be able to detect those things based off of my vulnerability management results. Next slide. So this is, one of the hardest things when you talk about vulnerability management, and that's enabling people to take action. And lo and behold, it involves you actually talking to people, which is, I know, some horrifying for some, but you actually have to work with your systems administrators, network administrators, down to a more granular level. Remediation in enabling people to take action is a huge part of vulnerability management. Don't think of vulnerability management as just finding vulnerabilities, waiting for someone else to fix them, and then repeating the process. That's going to be frustrating. It's going to lead to burnout. You have to incorporate all of those other groups into your vulnerability management process, and you need to set achievable goals for those people to be able to figure out what you can do. Sure, you may not be able to fix all 30,000 low, medium vulnerabilities, but let's identify the ones, do some threat modeling, and identify the ones that are likely to lead to a breach. Let's see if we can focus on those. Let's see if we can enable your systems administrators, your system owners, your developers to follow a process that's going to lead to that 30,000 vulnerability count coming down to 10,000 or 5,000, and then worry about prioritizing. Vulnerability management is all about working within your IT organization to have a really good process. It's using patch management effectively. It's using configuration management effectively. It's doing system hardening on all of your systems. If you're not doing all those things, yeah, you're going to have a lot of vulnerabilities. You're going to have a tough time prioritizing.
Well, and also kind of on that note, you talk about the process, but we're talking about processes that enable people to be brilliant. And far too many vulnerability management programs today are all about the process for the sake of the process. We want to standardize. We want a full process that we never deviate from. We want CVSS scores that we patch everything above this. And they try to make it so it doesn't allow for any human error. And look, anytime you ever try to standardize a process and lock it down to that specific process and you don't allow human brilliance, the only thing you're doing is standardizing mediocrity. You need to use the process to enable people to do amazing things, to allow your people to go hunting through these vulnerabilities, like Paul just mentioned, using threat modeling and saying, okay, well, we have a vulnerability. What's the threat? What would they be after? What would they be able to get access to? And allow them to think it through. A vulnerability management is not something robotic. It is not something that is a dead process that you just do rote every single time. It's an art form, and you have to treat it as such.
So yeah, vulnerability management, vulnerability scanning rather, is not what a pen test should do. We kind of talked about this. Tools have matured to allow for this continuous scanning, and believe it or not, that's actually the easy part, right? I mean, configuring these products on your network to go find problems on a methodic basis and not cause any adverse effect, is we know how to do this, right? It's the processes that come after that that are a lot more difficult. But don't look for a pen test to go do your vulnerability scan. You should be doing the vulnerability scanning. That's the easy part. Actually getting those problems fixed is the harder part. Define the evaluation criteria. You know, John and I talked a lot about different kinds of vulnerabilities and how they can be in your network, why they're in your network, how you should fix them. But you know, it comes down to you have to define for your vulnerability management program where are you going to look and what are you going to do if you find something in those areas. And vulnerability management has expanded into all of these areas of virtualization, cloud, mobile, patch management, agents, web apps, and even into a lot of the remediation efforts. So you need to look at this in a whole new light and not just think about your vulnerability management program implementing a network-based scanner that goes and finds missing patches. The technologies from all of the products on the market today can reach out into all of the areas in your network and identify problems. And it's figuring out what you're evaluating, what you're evaluating them against, defining what's bad, and then worrying about remediation and working that into your processes. That is really kind of the shift in the mindset that needs to happen when we talk about vulnerability management. Next slide. So one of the things that you can also glean from your vulnerability management program is how well my defenses are working. Is my antivirus software working? And it's not a vulnerability. It's more of a configuration thing, but it's also not the configuration of how the system is working, it's the configuration of your preventative measures. Is my antivirus working? Are my firewalls working? Are my systems hardened for security? It's those checks and balances to make sure that your defenses are working or not. This is a great inroads into getting into your other groups in your organization and saying, hey, we want to help you. We know you're implementing an antivirus program. We want to help you make sure that it's working as effectively as possible. We don't actually have to just point out the problems with it, but we want to arm you with the tools to know where you can make improvements on your defenses. The next slide. So this is my favorite slide. You should never give up on metrics, right? Now, there's a lot of ways in which you can present metrics to your organization. And a lot of people, I think, have struggled with how to present metrics, especially to management or to systems administrators. You have to use metrics to your example for your own advantage. Use them as a good example, and use them to help achieve your goals. A lot of times, metrics can be used to help management understand and give you help, to help management understand the threats and risk. And how you do that is very specific to your organization oftentimes. There's no magic bullet when it comes to metrics, but you know, I find that using metrics to highlight the groups that are doing well and contrast that with the groups that are not following some of your processes or not doing good vulnerability management, patch remediation, configuration management is a great way. The best example of metrics, I forget if it was Marcus Random or someone else wrote an article about a good example of metrics, and it was from a university example. He said, you know, I had this problem where I wanted to, in a university, I wanted to take more control over people's systems and help them manage it and manage it for them and implement some security. Now, some departments would do that with me and most of them wouldn't. So I went to management and I presented, look, here are all the security incidents that we had in the past 3 months. 85 to 90% of them happened in the areas where I wasn't managing the systems. Only 10 or 15% of them happened in the systems that I was able to manage. So I need management to help me convince these people to manage their systems and give me the staffing and resources to do so. And presenting metrics like this in that scenario is perfect. That's a perfect use case for metrics to help you achieve your goals. Next slide. We talked about threat modeling. We won't talk about CSI Cyber. Maybe later. I don't know if you watched that show, John.
No, I don't.
But I mean, that's one threat model, right? I was hacked.
I'm waiting for CSI APT to come out first.
Yeah, I was hacked and everyone died, right? I mean, that's to get there in your threat modeling. I mean, certainly you may use those kind of threat models, but threat modeling is extremely important. We've already kind of highlighted that. So next slide. Yeah, so a lot of people, it's kind of interesting. A lot of people will come to me and say, well, I'm redoing my vulnerability management program, or I'm implementing a vulnerability management program. Paul, I want you to tell me what's worked for others, and I just want to do that. And I'm like, well, why are you asking that? And they're like, well, I went to management, and I told them I wanted to do vulnerability management, and they came back to me and said, well, find out if there's a standard and find out who else is doing it in our industry, and we'll just do that. The big problem with that is that you haven't established yourself enough as a leader in your organization, so your team and your management is looking outside to find that leadership, and it's not going to come from already defined standards, right? You have to be established as a leader in your environment so that when Paul goes to management and say, well, we need vulnerability management and here's how I do it, they actually take the advice and don't ask me to go look outside. You have to understand enough about your organization. You have to build those relationships and present yourself as a leader in your environment in order to do a lot of the things that we talk about in vulnerability management.
And sometimes when working with management, it's really hard to. We did an assessment for an organization where their entire web infrastructure was still running Windows 2000. And management, well, we're not moving off Windows 2000 until you can prove to me that other people have done that too. So we went to Netcraft and we showed them that 0.0576 something 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 of the internet was running Windows 2000. It's basically like, well, it's pretty much you guys are responsible for half of all Windows 2000 systems on the internet today. It's hard because sometimes managers, it's just as Paul said, if they continue not to trust you, and if they continue to say, what is everybody else doing, then you could say it's your management's fault that they're an idiot. That's fine. You can play that game all you want. But the reality of the situation is they don't trust you, and you need to find a way to get them to trust you.
Mm-hmm. And that's, the leadership topic is something that we explored on a webcast I did with Michael Santarcangelo. I do have the archive from that. I will be posting it. You'll be able to watch part 1, and we're doing part 2 and part 3 that really centers around how to be a leader in your organization from a security perspective. We're targeting the security audience with this kind of message, and really telling people how to become a remarkable IT security leader and deal with these problems. And I wish there was like a magic list of just 5 tips that I could give you. But it's more involved than that, and I encourage everyone to take the time and really try and learn this process and learn this framework, because I really think it can help people, because in security we have these challenges where leadership is important, almost more important than a lot of other functions, and I think that there's a real gap in security in terms of leadership, because a lot of people have this struggle where we're trying to affect change in an organization, right? We're identifying problems and trying to affect change. And the only way that we can do that consistently is if we're recognized as a leader in our organization. So again, we're doing a whole 3-part webcast series on that. I do also want to share, John, some of my thoughts about the future of the market in terms of vulnerability management. I work in the strategy group focused on vulnerability management, and I look at a lot of different products. I look at a lot of different concepts that are evolving into products, and one of the things that really has struck me lately in terms of vulnerability management is if there isn't some way that you can start to, and I say start because this is a very tough concept for a lot of people, if there isn't a way where you can start to automatically remediate and tie that into your vulnerability management program, then I think it's kind of doomed for failure to start. And I think that there's a lot of the older generation that we're like, oh my God, I don't want to go automatically find things and automatically fix them. I've tried stuff like that before and I got burned by it. I think there's a younger generation that's like, well, let's give this a try, and they're a little more optimistic. I also think that technology has evolved to the point where we have so many vulnerabilities and exposures. The only way we're going to approach anything that resembles secure is if we're automatically fixing a lot of these vulnerabilities as we find them and blending vulnerability management with remediation. There's a lot of technology that's starting to do this already. There's a lot of integrations that can start doing this. This is really covering everything from applying patches, removing software, stopping services, changing configuration, and doing all those things to automatically remediate. I know that's scary for a lot of people. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet. We all know there's no silver bullets. I'm saying if we don't start trying this technology and start trying to implement it, that we're going to always have that 30,000 vulnerabilities that we can't fix. So that's one of my suggestions, is to start looking into some of those things and experimenting with them and working them into your vulnerability management program, and talk about doing some kind of remediation that is automated in your processes. Some of the technology is more advanced than others. You can automatically remediate by criteria, by severity, by group of systems. So the technology is really evolving. I think we have to learn to trust it, and I think we'll be in much better shape once we do.
All right. I think that's it.
So that's kind of my lens into the future of vulnerability management.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, you started talking to me about last week.
Yeah, and
Is if tools are just passively detecting things, it's going to be dead technology in 5 years.
yeah, exactly. And if anyone wants some recommendations on that, feel free to privately. I don't want to endorse any specific vendor or not, on the show, but there are some options out there depending on what you're looking to automate. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And as always, this will be recorded, and we will share it out with everybody. And all of our slides, as Paul has up here, are up on SlideShare. So write down that link as well. And once again, thank you so much. And when is the next one in the Security Leadership webcast? Isn't that coming out here in the next couple of weeks, Paul?
Yeah, it'll be sometime in August. I think we're doing August and then October or something like that. So
cool. And we have some bro stuff cooking up. We'll be having a bro webcast here shortly. Once again, thank you so much, everybody. Get out of here and have a great weekend. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
And with that,